The heavy envelope landed on the glass table with a soft thud. Evelyn stared at it, her heartbeat hammering against her ribs. Her fingers hesitated before tearing open the golden seal. Nathan Coleman's name was printed in elegant embossed letters, right next to another woman's. Her stomach twisted. He was getting married. The man who had broken her. The same one who had once promised her forever, only to discard her as if she meant nothing. Her fingers tightened around the invitation, nails digging into the expensive paper. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. What kind of twisted game was he playing? No, she wasn't going to hide. She wasn't going to let him think, even for a second, that he had destroyed her. The night of the wedding, Evelyn wore a sleek crimson satin dress that hugged every curve like a second skin. The neckline dipped just enough to tease, to provoke. Her dark hair cascaded in loose waves over her bare shoulders, her makeup flawless. She wanted him to see her, to feel her presence. When she stepped through the grand entrance of the luxurious venue, the murmurs died instantly. The silence was immediate, thick with tension. Everyone noticed her. But Nathan stood at the altar beside his bride, and the moment his eyes landed on her, it was as if he had been struck by lightning. His jaw tightened. His lips parted in disbelief. And then, something darker flickered in his gaze, anger and desire. She walked slowly, each step deliberate, each movement a statement. If he had invited her to humiliate her, he was about to realize that no one humiliates Evelyn Carter without consequences. The ceremony continued, but Nathan was restless. His eyes kept returning to her, again and again, as if he couldn't stop himself. His grip on his bride's hand tightened, his knuckles white, and then the officiant spoke. If anyone has any objections to this union, speak now or forever hold your peace. The air in the room grew suffocatingly thick. Evelyn smiled. She stood up slowly, the sound of her dress sliding against her skin, audible in the dead silence. Nathan went rigid. I have something to say. A collective gasp rippled through the guests. The bride's eyes widened in shock. Nathan took a step forward, his muscles coiled tight. Nathan, did you tell her why our marriage ended? Evelyn's voice was sugar-coated venom. The atmosphere shifted. The bride looked at him, alarmed. Nathan, what is she talking about? His gaze met Evelyn's, dark, furious, and hungry. The game had begun. The silence in the room was suffocating. Nathan's stare burned into Evelyn, a mix of fury and something far more dangerous, desire. The bride's voice trembled. Nathan, what is she talking about? Evelyn tilted her head, letting her hair cascade over her bare shoulder. A subtle but lethal provocation. Why don't you tell her, Nathan? She let the words drip from her lips, her voice deceptively sweet. Or should I? His jaw tightened. A muscle twitched at his temple, his fists clenching at his sides. The murmurs among the guests grew louder, the tension in the air thick and suffocating. But Evelyn only had eyes for him. Nathan took a single step forward. His body radiated heat, his presence overwhelming even in the vast room. Enough. His voice was a low growl, filled with warning. Evelyn arched a brow. Was he already losing control? Enough? Her lips curled in amusement. I thought you wanted me here. Thought you wanted me to see how happy you are. Nathan let out a humorless laugh. Dark, dangerous, possessive. So I ask, you always did enjoy provoking me. She held her ground, unflinching. Her dress clung to her body, the deep red fabric accentuating every curve, every inch of bare skin, a temptation he once claimed as his. And you always did enjoy losing control. His pupils dilated. His breathing deepened. One step, then another. Now he was right in front of her. So close she could feel the heat rolling off his body, the scent of him intoxicating, woodsy, dark, familiar. Yeah, you shouldn't have come. Evelyn tilted her chin up defiantly. She refused to let him intimidate her. Why? Because I remind you of what you lost. His gaze flickered down to her lips, then lower, tracing the curve of her throat, the rise and fall of her chest. His breathing was uneven now. No. Nathan reached out, his fingers brushing against her exposed arm. A barely there touch, but it set her skin on fire. "Bitchy, because you remind me of what I still want." The air between them turned electric. Evelyn's pulse pounded in her ears. His fingertips barely traced her skin, yet her entire body responded. She needed to get out of here, now. But before she could move, Nathan leaned in, his breath caressing her ear. "Tell me, Evelyn." His voice was a whisper, a seductive rasp that made her knees weak. "Are you shaking because you hate me or because you still want me?" Her breath hitched. She wanted to answer. She wanted to tell him to go to hell, but her body had already betrayed her. And Nathan knew it. The game had shifted. Now, he was the one in control. The tension between them was a live wire, sparking, dangerous. A pull neither of them could resist. Evelyn clenched her fists at her sides, trying to steady her breathing. Nathan was too close, too intoxicating, too familiar. She needed to leave before she did something she would regret. But she didn't move. Nathan tilted his head, his gaze dropping to her lips, his expression unreadable, but his intent clear. "Still want to pretend you feel nothing?" Evelyn forced a smile, slow and deliberate. She refused to let him see how much his presence was affecting her. "I'm not pretending, Nathan." His lips twitched, the ghost of a smirk playing at the corners. He knew she was lying. His fingers grazed her wrist, barely touching, but enough to send a shiver through her spine. Liar. Evelyn's breath caught, but she didn't pull away. Couldn't. Nathan exhaled sharply, his other hand coming up to trace the curve of her hip, his touch slow, possessive. The heat of his palm burned through the fabric of her dress. "So I say, you think showing up here looking like this wouldn't get a reaction out of me?" His voice was a deep, slow rumble. Evelyn swallowed hard. "I didn't come here for you." Nathan let out a low chuckle, dark and knowing. His fingers slid down her waist, resting at the small of her back. "Then why are you still standing here?" The air between them thickened. His body was so close, his scent. Wood, spice, danger. Wrapped around her, making her dizzy. She needed to escape, to regain control, so she did the only thing she could. Evelyn leaned in, just enough that her lips barely brushed his ear. A whisper, a tease, a threat. "Because I like watching you suffer." She felt him tense. A sharp inhale, his fingers digging into her waist just a little harder. And then, she pulled away. She stepped back, watching the way his chest rose and fell, the flicker of something wild in his eyes. His control was slipping. Good. Evelyn turned on her heel and walked away, her hips swaying deliberately, feeling his stare burning into her back. She had won this round, but she knew the game was far from over. Nathan wouldn't let her go that easily, and neither would she. Evelyn barely made it to the exit before she felt it. His presence, his heat, the way the air thickened with his intensity. She didn't have to turn around to know Nathan had followed her. She could feel him. The hallway was empty, silent except for the sound of her own breath and the sharp, deliberate steps of the man she had just walked away from. But she should have known better. Nathan never let her walk away. Before she could reach the door, a firm hand wrapped around her wrist, pulling her back. She gasped as her body collided with his, her hands instinctively pressing against his hard chest, feeling the steady pound of his heartbeat beneath her palms. Nathan's grip was unrelenting, his fingers burning into her skin. Not forceful, not painful, just enough to remind her that he still had control. Or at least, that's what he wanted her to believe. "Where do you think you're going?" His voice was low, dangerously smooth, like silk wrapped around steel. Evelyn swallowed hard, her breath hitching as she looked up at him. Their bodies were too close, too familiar, every inch of her aware of the solid heat radiating from him. She forced herself to smirk, tilting her head slightly. Walking away. "Isn't that what I'm good at?" Nathan's lips curled, but there was no amusement in his expression. Just hunger. Just raw, unapologetic possession. Not this time. His hand slid lower, fingers brushing the curve of her waist, his thumb grazing the exposed skin between the fabric of her dress. A slow, deliberate touch. A warning. Evelyn's breath faltered. He noticed. Of course, he noticed. His other hand came up, fingertips tracing along her jawline, tilting her face up until their mouths were inches apart. "You think you can just show up? Look at me like that and walk away untouched?" His voice was a whisper now, but it carried the weight of a promise. Evelyn's pulse pounded in her throat. Every fiber of her body screamed for her to move, to escape before it was too late. But she didn't move. She couldn't. His breath was warm against her lips, the scent of whiskey and danger intoxicating. His touch, his nearness, everything about him pulled her in like a drug she had sworn never to taste again. "Tell me to stop." The words were a challenge, a dare. Evelyn's lips parted, but nothing came out, because she didn't want him to stop. And Nathan knew it. He leaned in, his lips grazing the corner of her mouth. Not quite a kiss, but close enough to set her entire body on fire. That's what I thought." Her fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt, gripping it, grounding herself. She hated how easily he could unravel her. Nathan's lips moved lower, tracing the line of her jaw, his breath hot against her skin. "Come with me." It wasn't a question. It was an invitation, a dangerous one. Evelyn exhaled shakily, knowing exactly where this would lead. And yet, she didn't pull away. Because maybe, just maybe, she didn't want to. The elevator doors slid shut behind them. Silence wrapped around them like a velvet noose, thick, intoxicating, suffocating. Nathan stood close. Too close. Evelyn could feel the heat radiating from his body, the sheer intensity of his presence pressing against her. The space between them was nothing. A breath, a whisper, a heartbeat. Her back hit the mirrored wall, her breath hitching as Nathan followed, his body a wall of warmth and tension. His hands didn't touch her yet, but the weight of his gaze alone was enough to make her knees weak. The elevator began its slow ascent. Nathan exhaled, low and measured, his eyes dropping to her lips. "Tell me to stop." It was the same challenge as before, but this time the air crackled with something even darker, something primal. Evelyn should have. She should have said his name like a warning, like a plea to keep his distance. But she didn't. Nathan reached out, tracing a single finger down the length of her exposed collarbone, slow and deliberate. His touch barely there, yet her body reacted instantly. Her breath shuddered. She hated how much control he still had over her. "You're shaking." His voice was a whisper, a blade against her skin. Evelyn clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She couldn't let him win. So she did the only thing she could. She tilted her chin, her lips curving into a smirk even as her pulse pounded against her ribs. "And you're hard." Nathan stilled, his gaze darkened, and then he laughed. A low, knowing sound that sent a shiver down her spine. Because it wasn't amusement, it was satisfaction. "Still quick with that mouth, I see." Evelyn arched a brow, refusing to be intimidated. "You used to like that about me." Nathan moved then. A slow, predatory step closer. His hand came up, palm resting against the mirrored wall beside her head, caging her in. His other hand found the curve of her hip, fingers pressing into the fabric of her dress, not quite gripping, not quite letting go. Her breath stilled. The air was thick, charged, her skin burning under his fingertips. "I still do." The confession was low, raw, almost dangerous. Evelyn swallowed. She should push him away. But when his lips brushed the shell of her ear, when his voice dipped into something dark and molten, she knew she was already lost. But you already knew that. The elevator dinged. The doors slid open. Nathan pulled back, his fingers lingering for a fraction of a second before releasing her. His expression unreadable, his body thrumming with unspoken intent. Room 1203. He walked out without looking back. Evelyn stood frozen, her breathing shallow, her entire body on fire. She should leave, she should turn around, walk away, pretend this never happened. but as the elevator doors began to close, she found herself stepping forward. Because some fires weren't meant to be put out. And this was an inferno. Evelyn barely registered the sound of the hotel room door clicking shut behind her before Nathan had her against it. The air between them crackled, heat, tension, the undeniable pull of something reckless and raw. She had barely stepped inside, and yet she already knew. This was dangerous. Nathan's hand came up, fingers trailing the side of her neck, his touch feather-light but possessive, like he was claiming every inch of her before even touching her fully. You walked in here knowing exactly what was going to happen. His voice was dark silk, sliding over her skin, curling around her bones. Evelyn swallowed, her pulse thrumming wildly beneath his fingertips. I don't know what you're talking about. Nathan smirked, the kind of smirk that sent warning signals through her body. Liar. His lips brushed against her jaw. Not quite kissing, just enough for her to feel his breath ghosting over her skin. Her eyes fluttered shut, her fingers curling into his shirt. "Yeah, you keep saying that." Nathan hummed in response, his nose dragging down the curve of her neck, inhaling slowly. "Because you keep proving me right." His fingers slid lower, tracing the bare skin between the fabric of her dress and her thigh. Evelyn's breath hitched. He was taking his time, not rushing, not devouring her, savoring. Nathan always had a way of making everything feel inevitable, like she had no choice but to yield, like she was made to be beneath him. "Did you tell me to stop?" His voice vibrated against her throat. A dare, a command, a plea. Evelyn opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Because she didn't want him to stop. And Nathan could feel it. His grip tightened on her waist, pressing her fully against the door. His body a furnace, every hard line and sharp edge molded against her. That's what I thought. Then he kissed her, and it wasn't soft. It was hunger, it was dominance, it was years of tension unraveling all at once. His lips crushed against hers, demanding and unrelenting, his tongue sliding against hers in a way that made her knees buckle. Evelyn gasped into his mouth, her hands fisting in his hair as his fingers dug into the back of her thigh, lifting, anchoring her against him. She could feel everything. The sharp contrast between the cool door at her back and the heat of his body caging her in, the way his muscles tensed beneath her touch, the way his breath turned ragged when she bit his lower lip. Nathan groaned, deep and guttural, the sound vibrating through her chest. Then suddenly, he pulled back. Evelyn barely had time to catch her breath before he spun her around, pressing her front against the door, his chest flush against her back. "So do you think you can just walk back into my life and play this game, sweetheart?" His voice was rough, edged with something dangerous. Evelyn shivered. "Maybe." Nathan chuckled, but there was nothing amused about it. His hands skimmed down her arms, over the curve of her hips, his breath hot against her ear. "Then, let's play." And just like that, she was his to ruin all over again. Evelyn's palms were pressed against the cold hotel door, her breath uneven, her skin burning from Nathan's touch. The contrast between the chilled surface and the molten heat of his body behind her was intoxicating. He hadn't moved, not yet, but she could feel him. The solid weight of him, the slow rise and fall of his chest, the way his fingers skimmed the delicate strap of her dress before dragging down the exposed skin of her back. Her pulse pounded in her throat. "Do you even know what you're playing with, Evelyn?" His voice was low, smooth, dangerously calm, but the way his fingers tightened on her hip, the way his breath turned heavier, told her he was seconds away from losing control. And she wanted that. She wanted to push him over the edge. She turned her head slightly, her lips brushing the sharp line of his jaw as she whispered, "Are you afraid you'll lose?" Nathan chuckled, but it was dark, almost sinister. His hand slid around her waist, pulling her flush against him, his body a furnace against her back, every hard muscle molding into her curves. "Sweetheart," he murmured, his lips grazing the sensitive skin of her neck. "I don't lose. I take." A shiver ran down her spine, her stomach tightening as his words coiled around her like a threat, like a promise. Nathan's hands moved slowly, deliberately, one splaying against her lower abdomen, pulling her back into him, the other slipping under the strap of her dress, tracing the bare skin of her shoulder. "Tell me to stop." The words were a whisper, a demand wrapped in velvet. Evelyn's fingers curled into fists against the door. She should have said it. She should have walked away before it was too late, but instead, she exhaled. A shaky, almost desperate sound, and that was all it took. Nathan gripped her jaw, tilting her head back, his mouth claiming hers in a kiss that was nothing short of devastation. It was deep, unrelenting. Teeth, tongue, heat. A war of mouths. A collision of past and present. She gasped against his lips when his fingers trailed down her spine, over the zipper of her dress, slowly dragging it lower. The fabric loosened, sliding down her body inch by inch, exposing more, revealing more. Nathan groaned, his grip on her tightening. "God, you're dangerous." Evelyn smirked, her breath shallow, her body already responding to him in ways she couldn't control. "And you're addicted to danger." His response was a growl, deep and guttural, his teeth scraping against her shoulder before he spun her around. Her back hit the door, her dress barely hanging on her frame, her chest rising and falling rapidly as Nathan caged her in with his body. His hand slid up her thigh, parting her legs slightly, his thumb pressing into the sensitive skin above her knee. His other hand cupped her jaw, tilting her face up, forcing her to meet his gaze. "I want to hear you say it." Evelyn swallowed, her pulse hammering against her ribs. Nathan's thumb traced the outline of her lips, his touch feather-light, but his eyes were anything but soft. "Say it, sweetheart." Evelyn's breath hitched. She wanted to fight him. Wanted to pretend that she still had the upper hand, but they both knew the truth. She was already his. So she gave in. "I want you." Nathan's pupils dilated, his lips curled, victorious. "That's all I needed to hear." Then he ruined her all over again. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only him, only her, only the fire that had been smoldering between them for far too long, now threatening to consume them both. Nathan's mouth crashed against hers, hot, hungry, claiming. His hands roamed her body with slow, deliberate possession, like he had all the time in the world to unravel her. Evelyn arched into him, her fingers sinking into his hair, her nails scraping against his scalp as she pulled him closer. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Nathan growled against her lips, his grip on her hips tightening, his body pressing against hers with an intensity that made her breath hitch. "Don't you drive me insane?" His voice was rough, laced with hunger. It wasn't a complaint, it was a confession. Evelyn smirked, breathless, her body pulsing with anticipation. "Then lose your mind, Nathan." And he did. His lips traced a path down her throat, teeth grazing, tongue soothing. Evelyn shuddered, her hands gripping his shoulders as he pressed her harder against the door, his knee slipping between her legs. The friction made her gasp, made her want more. Nathan's hands slid lower, fingers curling around the hem of her dress, bunching the fabric at her hips. This dress was a mistake. Evelyn exhaled a shaky breath, her skin igniting where his fingers teased her thigh. "Why?" Nathan smirked against her neck, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. "Because it's in my way." With one swift motion, he peeled the fabric from her body, letting it pool at her feet. Evelyn stood before him in nothing but lace and temptation. Nathan's breath hitched, his gaze darkened, dropping to the exposed curves of her body, a muscle ticking in his jaw as if he was barely holding himself back. "You're going to be the death of me." Evelyn tilted her head, eyes gleaming with challenge. "Then die with me." Nathan exhaled sharply. Then he was on her again. Their mouths collided, all control snapping as his hands mapped every inch of her skin. His touch was fire, burning a path down her spine, gripping her waist, pulling her flush against him. She could feel everything. The heat of his body, the raw strength beneath his skin, the way he trembled with restraint. She didn't want restraint. She wanted destruction. Her fingers found the buttons of his shirt, ripping them open with impatient hands, pushing the fabric off his shoulders. Nathan smirked against her lips. "Size easy impatient, sweetheart." Evelyn dragged her nails down his bare chest, delighting in the way his muscles tensed under her touch. "I've waited long enough." Nathan's control snapped. He lifted her effortlessly, her legs wrapping around his waist as he carried her across the room, his lips never leaving hers. When her back hit the bed, he hovered over her, his gaze heavy, dark, unreadable. "Say it again." Evelyn's breath was ragged, her heart hammering against her ribs. She reached up, threading her fingers through his hair, pulling him closer. "I want you." Nathan's eyes flashed with something primal, something dangerous. "Then let me ruin you." And as his lips trailed lower, as his hands mapped every inch of her body, Evelyn knew she was already undone. The room was silent, except for the sound of their ragged breaths. The heat between them still lingered in the air, thick and intoxicating, wrapping around them like a second skin. Evelyn lay beneath him, her body still humming from the storm they had just unleashed. Her skin burned where his hands had been, where his mouth had claimed her. Every nerve still alive, still desperate for more. Nathan hovered over her, his weight pressing into her in a way that was both grounding and possessive. His fingers traced lazy patterns down her arm, his eyes dark and unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Words felt unnecessary. Then, his voice, low, raspy, laced with something she couldn't quite place. "You should have never come back." Evelyn exhaled slowly, her gaze locked onto his. The tension between them hadn't broken. If anything, it had only thickened. And yet, here we are. Nathan let out a humorless chuckle, shaking his head. His fingers moved to her jaw, tilting her chin up, forcing her to hold his gaze. "You have no idea what you just did, do you?" Evelyn swallowed, feeling the weight of his words press down on her chest. She knew. She had shattered the fragile wall between them, dragged them both back into something they had barely survived the first time, but she wasn't sure she cared. Nathan's thumb brushed over her lower lip, a touch so intimate it made her stomach tighten. "Say it." Evelyn blinked. "Say what?" His gaze darkened, his grip on her tightening slightly. That this meant something. Her breath hitched. Because it had. It always did. But admitting it meant losing. And she refused to lose to him. So instead she forced a smirk, tilting her head defiantly. "It was just sex, Nathan." The shift in his expression was immediate. The fire in his eyes didn't die. It exploded, but it wasn't the same kind of heat anymore. It was anger. Frustration. Something deeper. Evelyn barely had time to react before he was moving again, his body pressing into hers, his mouth brushing against her ear. His voice, dark, dangerous. Liar. Her stomach flipped, because she knew she had pushed him too far. Nathan pulled back just enough to look at her, his fingers trailing down her arm. His touch softer now, almost mocking. "You always were good at running, weren't you?" Evelyn's jaw clenched. She knew where this was going. "And you were always good at chasing." Nathan smirked. "Then run, sweetheart." He leaned in, his lips barely grazing hers. "See if I don't catch you." And just like that, the game had started again. Only this time, there would be no escape. Evelyn barely made it out of the hotel room before she felt it. His presence, thick in the air, wrapping around her like a shadow she couldn't outrun. She had walked away, but she could still feel him. His hands on her skin, his breath on her neck, the weight of his body pressing into hers. Her body ached, still tuned to the way he touched her, the way he claimed her, like he had a right to. And maybe he did. She stepped into the elevator, pressing the button with shaking fingers. Her heart was still racing, her skin still burning. But as the doors began to close, a hand shot between them. The doors slid open. Nathan. Her breath caught. He stepped inside, towering over her, his presence overwhelming, his gaze burning. He didn't speak. Didn't have to. The air between them was thick, electric, suffocating. Evelyn swallowed, tilting her chin up, forcing a smirk she didn't quite feel. "Coming to say goodbye?" Nathan's jaw tightened. His body was too still, too controlled, but his eyes told a different story. "You don't get to walk away from this." His voice was low, measured, but beneath it, there was something deeper, something unhinged. Evelyn leaned against the wall, crossing her arms over her chest, playing at nonchalance even as her body betrayed her. "Watch me." Nathan exhaled slowly. Then, without warning, he moved. Fast. One hand braced against the wall beside her head, the other curled around her jaw, tilting her face up until their lips were just inches apart. "Chaisaz, you still think this is a game?" His voice was a whisper. Low, dark, lethal. Evelyn swallowed, her pulse hammering against her ribs, because this wasn't a game anymore. Nathan's thumb dragged across her lower lip, slow, deliberate. Her breath hitched, her stomach twisting, her body leaning into his touch before she could stop it. He smirked. Because he felt it. He always did. "You can run, sweetheart." His lips brushed her ear, his breath sending shivers down her spine. "But we both know you'll come back." Evelyn's nails dug into her palms, her control slipping. She hated him for being right. Nathan's lips hovered over hers, close enough to make her dizzy, close enough to make her crave. "Tell me to stop." She should have. She should have pushed him away, should have walked out of the elevator the second the doors opened, but she didn't. Instead, she whispered, "I hate you." Nathan's smirk widened. Liar. Then, he kissed her, and Evelyn knew. There was no walking away this time. The kiss was fire. Consuming, reckless, a collision of mouths and bodies that neither of them had the strength to stop. Nathan's hands were firm, one tangled in her hair, the other gripping her waist, anchoring her against him as if he was afraid she'd disappear. Evelyn gasped against his lips, her fingers curling into his shirt, fisting the fabric as her body melted into his. She could taste him. Whiskey, heat, something dark and addictive. The elevator dinged. Neither of them moved. Nathan pushed her harder against the wall, his body flush against hers, his mouth trailing down her jaw, his teeth scraping the sensitive skin of her neck. "Tell me to stop." His voice was raw, rough, desperate. Evelyn's breath hitched. She should have said it, but instead she tilted her head, giving him more access, more permission. Nathan groaned, his hands sliding lower, gripping her hips, pulling her tighter against him. "Damn it, Evelyn." His mouth crashed into hers again, and this time, it was war. Teeth, tongue, a battle neither of them wanted to win. The elevator doors slid open. Nathan barely broke the kiss as he wrapped an arm around her waist and pulled her out, walking them backward into his suite. The door slammed behind them. Evelyn's back hit the wall. Nathan was on her instantly. His hands, his mouth, his body demanding everything she had left to give. Her dress slipped lower. His fingers traced the newly exposed skin, his touch slow, teasing, knowing. Evelyn let out a shaky breath, her nails digging into his shoulders. "But you don't get to do this." Nathan stilled, his lips hovered over hers, his eyes burning into her. "Do what?" Evelyn swallowed. "Make me want you again." A slow, dark smirk curved his lips. "Sweetheart, you never stopped." His hand slid to her thigh, fingers pressing into soft skin. His grip firm, unrelenting. Evelyn shuddered, because she knew he was right, and she hated him for it. Nathan exhaled sharply, his forehead resting against hers. "Say it." Evelyn's heart pounded. She couldn't. She wouldn't. Nathan's grip on her tightened, his lips ghosting over hers, waiting. "Say it, Evelyn." Her pulse was a drumbeat in her ears. Her body ached, burned, begged for him. And when she finally spoke, it wasn't the word she had planned to say. It was the truth. "I'm still yours." Nathan's breath caught. Then, he kissed her like he was never letting her go again. Nathan didn't hesitate. The second the words left her lips, he took her fully, completely, without restraint. His mouth crashed onto hers, A kiss that wasn't just passion, but possession. Years of unresolved hunger finally breaking free. Evelyn melted into him, her hands gripping his shoulders, her body responding to his every touch. He lifted her effortlessly, her legs wrapping around his waist, their bodies molding together as if they had never been apart. Nathan walked them backward, his lips never leaving hers, his hands mapping the curves he had missed, rediscovering every inch of her. The back of her knees hit the bed. Evelyn gasped as she fell onto the mattress, her hair fanning out around her, her breath coming in short, shallow pants. Nathan stood above her, his chest rising and falling, his gaze dark and unreadable as he took her in, flushed, breathless, completely his. "You're still mine." The words were raw, laced with emotion he never voiced. Evelyn swallowed, her throat tight. She should have denied it, should have pushed him away. But instead, she whispered back, "Yes." Nathan exhaled sharply. Then he was on her again. His lips traced the curve of her neck, his breath hot against her skin, his hands sliding down her body with the same urgency she felt in her bones. Evelyn arched into him, her body burning under his touch. Every kiss, every graze of his fingertips left a trail of fire. "You ruined me, Evelyn." His voice was a low growl, his teeth scraping against her collarbone. Evelyn gasped, her nails digging into his back. "Then ruin me back." Nathan froze, his grip on her tightened. Then he did exactly that. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a golden glow over tangled sheets and tangled limbs. Evelyn stirred, her body aching, a slow reminder of the night before. She felt him before she saw him. Nathan's arm was draped over her waist, his body warm, solid, familiar against hers. For the first time in years, he hadn't let go. Evelyn inhaled slowly, her heart tightening as realization settled over her. This wasn't just lust. It had never been. Nathan shifted, his lips pressing against her bare shoulder, his voice husky with sleep. "Tell me you're staying." Evelyn closed her eyes. Her walls were gone, her defenses shattered. She turned to face him, her fingers trailing over his jaw, her voice barely a whisper. "I never really left." Nathan smiled, and this time, he didn't let her go. Love isn't always simple. Sometimes it's messy, raw, tangled in past mistakes and lingering desires. Evelyn and Nathan fought against their feelings, but in the end, they couldn't deny what had always been there. What about you? Do you believe in second chances? Would you risk your heart for a love that never truly faded? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one waiting for you on screen. Click now and dive into another passionate romance that will leave you breathless.